Nihilism in general is a philosophical position that you can have about a lot of different things. It just says, hey, that thing that you think is a thing, it's not really a thing. Moral nihilism just does that with moral or ethical claims. They're saying that, like, hey, these moral statements, they're not true. That's what these two views, non-cognitivism and error theory, that's what they both have in common. They're both going to say that moral statements are not true, but their explanation for why they're not true are very different. So let's talk about it. So we've got two views under this heading, non-cognitivism and error theory. For the non-cognitivist, moral statements aren't true because they're not even propositions. They're not claims. They're not the kinds of statements that can even have a truth value. So, they can't be true, but they can't be false either. Error theory is a slightly different approach. So they're going to agree that moral statements are not true, but they're going to say that they're not true because they're always false. So the non-cognitivists, moral statements don't even have a truth value. They're not true and they're not false. Error theorists, they say that moral statements do have a truth value. They're just all false. We're going to unpack each of these and see what kind of story they have to say, because, like, if this is the view, they're going to have to give some kind of story about what moral language is. You can't just, like, say something like this and then just, like, not give an interpretation of what, stealing is wrong, what that statement means. So that's what we've got to unpack with each of these views. So the non-cognitivist, I mentioned that they are going to hold that moral claims are not propositions. A proposition is just a statement that has a truth value. A statement that's either true or false, right? Paris is the capital of France. That's a true proposition. Squirrels are reptiles. That's a false proposition. Aliens exist somewhere. That's a proposition. We just don't know what its truth value is, but it's either true or false. But some kinds of statements, some kind of sentences, I guess, aren't propositions, right? Where's your pet gerbil? That's not true. That's not false. It's just, it's just a question. Or how about this? Close the door. That's not true. That's not false. That's just, a command to close the door. So the non-cognitivists, what they're doing is they're saying moral claims, they fit here. They are not propositions. So they're not going to have a truth value. They're not going to be true. They're not going to be false either, but they're not going to be true. Now, this is actually why these guys are called non-cognitivists, right? Cognitive, thought, thinking, belief, that kind of thing. Because if moral statements aren't propositions, they can't be beliefs, right? Because your beliefs take as their objects, presumably, right? Propositions. That's the kind of thing you believe. You believe, Earth is a sphere. That's a proposition. You believe that today is Wednesday or whatever. That's a proposition. If they're not propositions, they can't be the objects of belief. So that's why they're called non-cognitivists, because it's sort of saying, like, hey, there's not really any kind of belief state going on in there with respect to moral claims. Now, non-cognitivists come in two flavors nowadays, at least two flavors. Emotivists, who hold that, and this is just going to come down to, like, how they interpret moral language. The emotivist is going to say that moral claims are just like sort of emotive expressions. So when I say, abortion is wrong, I'm just like, oh, abortion, oh, right? That's not a proposition. It's just an emotive expression. Now, you can kind of like glean some things about it, like I kind of clearly don't approve of it or something like that. But it's not a proposition. It's not like a belief state. Prescriptivism translates stuff like stealing is wrong, abortion is wrong, to just prescriptive statements. Don't steal. Don't engage in abortion. Don't lie, right? Those, and again, right, when we saw shut the door, right, that was just a command. So don't steal, right? Just a command. So on either view, right? Moral claims are not propositions, so they don't have a truth value, so they can't be true. It's a really interesting kind of move. So let's compare everything we've talked about so far. So again, for the subjectivist, I personally disapprove of stealing. For the relativist, my culture, my society personally disapproves of stealing. These are the two anti-realist views. For the non-cognitivist, right, it doesn't even translate to a proposition, right? This is a proposition. This is true, a true statement about somebody's, personal preferences about stealing. This is a true statement. So it's a proposition, and it's a statement about some culture or society's preferences. These are not propositions. So that's why you get a non-cognitivist view. Now, a lot of people are going to say that this is Hume's logical conclusion. And that kind of makes sense, right? He talks about how, oh gosh, there's reason and there's passion, and reason doesn't motivate you to act, but passion does. Oh, well, if these are passion states, maybe they're emotive states, something like that. We're going to talk about J.L. Mackey's argument for queerness. Now, this is actually an argument for error theory, the other nihilistic view, but non-cognitivists can co-opt this argument as well. And then the idea that moral disagreement is just kind of irresolvable. The word we use is intractable. You would think that if these were propositions, we would have come to some kind of agreement by now. It's been a while, and we just haven't come to an agreement about a lot of things. So maybe there is nothing there to actually agree on. Maybe they're not even propositions. We're just sort of emotively expressing very loudly at each other. So that is the non-cognitivist view. Let's talk about error theory. And error theory in general, there are different kinds of error theories. So this is an error theory about morality or moral claims. And an error theory in general is just saying that all of the statements within some topic, some domain of discourse, all of the statements are false. So these guys agree with the non-cognitivists that moral statements are not true. They both agree that moral statements are not true. But remember, the non-cognitivists are going to say, well, they're not false either. They don't have a truth value. These guys are saying they do have a truth value, and they are, in fact, false. So, we might think that we're making some kind of moral claim or whatever, but we're just not. And that's where the error comes in. So this can be a little bit weird to wrap your head around, because take these two claims. So killing is impermissible. The error theorist is going to say, well, that's false. Okay, then killing is permissible. The error theorist is going to say, nope, that's false too. And our intuition is surely one of these two statements has to be true, right? How can they both be false, right? They're opposites of each other. Surely one has to be true. The diagnosis of this problem is that this property of permissibility or wrongness or whatever, these moral properties aren't really properties. And so you are just wrong to ascribe these properties to things. It would kind of be let's say we lived in a colorless world. Everything was just shades of gray or something like that. Then nothing would have color properties. So if I was well, that's red, well, no, that's false. Okay, then it's green. No, that's false, right? Any color property that I give is going to be false because there just aren't color properties, right? If the predicate isn't a thing, then the statement itself is just going to be false. Now, I've got some examples here, some analogies to try and drive this point home. This first one is, I think, a little bit easier to understand, but it's a little bit more contentious. Let's suppose, we're just going to pretend for a second that God doesn't exist, okay? And so we've got Alice, who is a theist, so somebody who believes in God, but she's mistaken. And we've got Bob, who is just a correct atheist. So Alice says, oh, God loves you. And Bob says, nope, that's false. Alice says, okay, so God hates you? Nope, also false. Okay, so God is indifferent then? Nope, false. Right? How can all of those be false? Because, again, under our assumption, there is no God to be loving or hating or being indifferent about. So the domain of discourse and error theory would be applicable if there were no God. Now, this is obviously going to be a little bit contentious. I've got another one that I think does work. It's just maybe a little bit harder to sort of get at. Astrology, not astronomy, astrology. So like the notion that like the position of stars and planets in the night sky will somehow affect your personality I'm not into astrology. But, it's all hokum. It's all bunk. It's nonsense, right? And so any kind of astrological claim, oh, you're a Virgo, so you're a logical person. I'm not a Virgo, right? Like, that's not a thing. That's not a property that a thing can have, being a Virgo. And so it's kind of funny. You can actually, like, look up, because the Earth is wobbled, it proceeded on its axis. And so, like, the astrological signs that were there, like you don't have that sign anymore or something. It's wild stuff. But I do think like error theory just kind of gets astrology right, whether you're a Virgo or a Capricorn or whatever, like those aren't properties that you can have. Those aren't like meaningful things. And so any statement that like an astrologer makes is just kind of going to be false. So, an argument for error theory. And this is where J.L. Mackie comes in. This is a super, super famous argument. So it's worth at least just kind of mentioning here. So if moral objectivism, if the idea is that like morality really does, is mind independent, and that these, then there would have to be these like moral properties. Okay. And in fact, like, it seems like if I'm going to say that X is wrong or X is permissible, there would have to be moral properties. But moral properties are like super weird. Like, if you sit down and think about it, like, moral properties are really weird. That's what the word queerness means here. It's like, it's really strange. Think about, so like, take a red, round, soft ball, okay? And all of the properties that this ball has, right? Its color and its shape and its size and its mass and everything. And, you can take it and you can like measure it and all that stuff, but where's the property of wrongness, right? Let's say I take this red ball and I throw it and I hit you right in the face with it. That's kind of mean. I mean, it's a softball, so maybe it doesn't hurt that much, but like it's still kind of mean, and it seems like it's the wrong thing to do. Mackey's going to say, okay, so we've got the ball and we've got your face and we've got the throwing, but like where's the wrongness here? Where does that property come out? It's like, oh yeah, like moral properties are kind of weird. So they're just too metaphysically strange to exist, so they don't exist. So moral objectivism is false. And so are all moral claims. They would all have to be false because they rely on these properties. Now, there's a similar argument Mackey makes about the epistemological problem, the problem of knowledge for moral properties. And it's kind of the same idea, right? Like you come to learn about the properties of our red, round, soft ball by like investigating it and stuff. Like that's how you come to know things. How do you know about wrongness or rightness? What is the method of knowledge acquisition for those kinds of properties? Again, it just seems really mysterious, really odd. In Mackey's terms, they're very queer, they're very strange. And so it's an interesting kind of argument. That's going to be the argument for error theory. That's going to be also the argument that the non-cognitivists kind of co-op and just sort of take a little bit step further there. So Here's all the views we've talked about so far. Our two anti-realist views, subjectivism and relativism. These guys both agree because they both agree that like moral truth is mind dependent. That moral truths depend on what somebody thinks, what their preferences are, either an individual or a group of people. These guys, what they have in common is they agree that moral statements are not true. They just have a slightly different story as to what's going on. These guys say they're not true, but they're not false either, because they're not propositions. These guys say they're not true, but they are false, right? They're just all false because there aren't such things as moral properties. So we talked about anti-realism. We talked about nihilism. Next, we're going to talk about moral objectivism. This is the view that we're going to kind of have to assume in order to like do ethical theorizing. So I want to make sure we spend a decent amount of time talking about what it is and what it isn't, common misconceptions about it. So it'll be a really important video. I'll see you then.